I'm Phil Griffin. I'm one of the board members of Fort Collier. I'm also the treasurer, so if you want to make a donation, you come and see me at the beginning or the end. We have t-shirts for sale in the side room over here. Welcome to the Stein family reunion, and welcome to the 161st anniversary of the Third Battle of Winchester. So we're here to introduce Jonathan Noyalas, who's the director of the Civil War Institute and a professor of history at Shenandoah University. So I'll turn the program over to him. He's given a tour of this battlefield site for the last several years, so I think you guys are in for a real treat today. Thank you.
So, good morning, everyone. If you all want to come in a little bit closer, as my students who are here will tell you, I do not bite. So one little logistical thing before we begin. So we're going to be walking around this part of Fort Collier this morning. We'll spend about an hour out here. I am happy to take questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand so that my work study, Russell Brown, can get you a microphone, because this is being recorded as well, so you can be famous in social media circles if you ask a question. Before I begin, I wanted to just mention that today we have decided to dedicate this touring program to Dr. Brandon Beck. So there are some of you who have known me for a long time, going back to when I was a student at Shenandoah University. Brandon Beck was the founder of the Civil War Institute. He founded it in 1992. He was my undergraduate mentor. He was so critical to the preservation and interpretation of this site. I actually worked with him when I was a student back in the late 90s on interpreting. So all these signs here Dr. Beck and I worked on together. He passed away recently. He was 80 years old. And so I wanted to just dedicate this tour this morning to the man who played such a critical role in preserving this 10-acre site. So traditionally, on an anniversary of the Third Battle of Winchester, yesterday was technically the actual day of the battle, we would come out here and talk about the role of Fort Collier on September 19, 1864. We're not going to do that today. Today we're going to do something a little bit different and talk about the construction of this fort, the use of this fort during those early years of the Civil War. And to kind of help set the stage, I want you to understand how very indefensible Winchester was. So Winchester, during the course of the Civil War, changed hands scores of times. So the numbers, they vary. So if you go to the visitor center, you can buy a t-shirt that says Winchester changed hands 72 times. If you look at some accounts of veterans, they say Winchester changed hands as many as 96 times during the war. Whatever number you use, 72, 96, or anywhere in between, it's a lot. Okay, so Winchester is a revolving door during the course of the conflict. There are three major battles fought in Winchester, one in May of 1862, one in mid-June of 1863, and of course the third battle on September 19th, 1864, 161 years ago yesterday. By the midpoint of the Civil War, soldiers who were in defense of Winchester and had been defeated were starting to wonder, what was it about this place that makes it so vulnerable to attack? So in the aftermath of the Second Battle of Winchester, a young lieutenant from the 122nd Ohio, his name was James Hartley, he was part of that Union force commanded by General Robert Milroy that was just annihilated during the second battle. He was lucky enough to get out of Winchester and avoid capture. About a week after the battle, he wrote in his diary something that I believe is very, very insightful about the difficulties in defending Winchester during the conflict. And this is what he wrote. I used to wonder why it was that no force could hold that place, and probably you may wonder the same. Winchester is situated in the Shenandoah Valley in a very pretty place, with elevations all around, and presents no front to the enemy, but can be approached from any or every direction. If I was going to fight the rebels again, I would rather be on the outside and undertake to take the place from them than to be on the inside and try to defend it. It will take more men to defend the place than it will to take it. It can be surrounded, as we were at any time, and all communications cut off. So it's very difficult to conceive of this today because of all the development that has happened in Winchester. But the areas north of Fort Collier, so that is north, the areas east of Fort Collier, these are all open plains. South of Winchester, it's all open plains and fields. So it's very easy to approach this place. The only place that is actually defensible is the far northwestern corner of town, and that is over there. So we're going to move from this site now and start talking about why this site was chosen as the location for an earthwork fortification, and it is the first earthwork fort built in Winchester during the war. And if you look at a map of Winchester created, autumn of 1864, you can kind of connect the dots. This whole city was encircled by fortifications, very much like Washington, D.C. was during the conflict. But this is the very first. And so I'll take questions if you have any. If not, we're going to move down the path out here into that far field and start talking about why Confederates are deciding to build a fortification here in the summer of 1861. Any questions? Comments? Nobody wants to be mic'd up. That's what it is. All right, so follow me. Yeah, I'm going to show you, not this house was built after the war. I'm going to show you an image when we get up there. So in order to understand why this fort is constructed, we need to go back to late May of 1861. So this is very early on into the conflict, a little more than a month after the Confederates attacked Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. So on May 24th, 1861, Joseph E. Johnston arrives in Harper's Ferry as commander of Confederate forces in that location, and basically he's in charge of all troops in the Shenandoah Valley. So Joe Johnston, when he gets to Harper's Ferry, so Harper's Ferry is about 29 miles from here. It is that away. When he gets to Harper's Ferry, he is deeply concerned about the ability to protect his very small army. So on May 24th, 1861, his army has about 5,200 men in it. Now eventually there will be more recruits, and by the time you get to mid-June, he has about 9,100 men, but it's very, very small. And in late May of 1861, there's a terrible drought in this part of the world. And so the Potomac River is really easily fordable both above and below Harper's Ferry. So Joe Johnston is concerned that Federal forces can cross the Potomac anywhere. They can get into Virginia, they can cut him off, they can destroy him. So between Harper's Ferry and Winchester, Joe Johnston believed that Winchester was the much more strategically significant location. He also believed that of those two positions, it was the much more defensible place. So he starts writing letters to Confederate President Jefferson Davis in Richmond and Robert E. Lee, who was commander of forces in Virginia. And what he is doing is he is basically begging and pleading with Jefferson Davis and Lee to allow him to pull his forces out of Harper's Ferry and bring them to Winchester. And it's really interesting to look at the communications going back and forth between these guys during this period, because both Lee and Davis are saying, you need to stay put. We think that Harper's Ferry is the better place. We think that if you leave Harper's Ferry, that it would have a demoralizing impact on the Confederacy. Just giving up a location without any sort of fight whatsoever. And Joe Johnston wrote a letter back, and I love this response. He says, don't you think it would be more demoralizing if my entire army was gobbled up by Union forces because I'm heavily outnumbered in an indefensible location and I can be attacked from multiple points? And that was kind of a, oh yeah, we didn't think of that sort of moment. So maybe the place isn't as important as keeping the force intact. So you have all this back and forth going on, and then you get to June the 10th. And on June the 10th, Joe Johnston learns that a force commanded by Robert Patterson, a Union force of about 12,000 men, is moving from Chambersburg, Pennsylvania to Hagerstown, Maryland. And then from Hagerstown, they're going to move to Martinsburg, which is where I live. And so as that movement is taking place, Joe Johnston says to Lee and Davis both, you really need to seriously reconsider my request to move to Winchester. And so finally on June the 15th, he is given permission to move from Harper's Ferry to Winchester. He arrives in Winchester 2 days later, June the 17th. One of the first things that Joe Johnston is going to do when he arrives in Winchester, after he sets up headquarters in the Taylor Hotel, which is on the Walking Mall. So if you know downtown Winchester, McAdoo's restaurant, that's where Joe Johnston sets up his headquarters when he arrives on the 17th. The first thing he does is he tries to figure out, okay, I am here now. How do I protect my command? How do I defend this place? And so Winchester, of course, is a major transportation hub. You not only have the Valley Pike, so what is Route 11 today, that is the Valley Pike during the course of the conflict. Obviously the roadbed has changed and shifted a little bit over the years, but for all intents and purposes, that is the Valley Pike. You have also a railroad that runs from Harper's Ferry to Winchester. And of course, the rail line that is here today during the Civil War was part of the Winchester and Potomac Railroad. But today, the railroad extends all the way through, it runs all the way through town. The rail line in 1861 ended here. This is as far as the tracks went. So Joe Johnston is trying to figure out, okay, what is of significance for me to protect? Where is the greatest threat going to come from? Well, the greatest threat is going to come from that direction. If Robert Patterson decides to march his men those 22, 23 miles from Martinsburg, which is a Unionist stronghold, march them from Martinsburg to Winchester, he is going to use the Martinsburg Pike. So So the Valley Pike north of Winchester is called the Martinsburg Pike. He is going to use that road. And so he has to figure out what are the best options for me to protect that road. And so he calls in his chief engineering officer, General William Henry Chase Whiting, and he asks him, let's go out and do a survey. Let's figure out where are those vulnerable points? Where can we best protect against a potential assault coming from the north, coming from Patterson, coming from Martinsburg? And ultimately, William Henry Chase Whiting will decide that this location, the Stein Farm, a 380-acre farm in 1861, that if you're going to protect the Martinsburg Pike, that this is the best place to do it. So I've had already a couple questions walking down here about the house and what this place looked like. I will show you an image in a moment when we get into the shade a little bit closer to the earthworks and show you what this property looked like. And then we're going to transition, starting to discuss the family who lived here and how this forever transformed their lives. Questions? So Russell's earning his money. Russell's my work. He gets $8 an hour.
I'm just here to round up the women and children. You mentioned Harper's Ferry.
Mm-hmm.
A year and a half or so before, it was John Brown era.
Right.
Was that mythology / image still fresh in the politician's mind about holding that you've read about?
So are you asking, are they wanting to hold on to for symbolic reasons?
Yeah, you know, it used to be the arsenal too.
Correct.
And I'm wondering if that's why the politicians want to hold on to Harper's Ferry, because John Brown has done his thing there a year and a half.
No, I think there's a more practical reason. So there's the psychological, not for its connections to Brown, because I think actually, you know, historians, we have looked at this, and if you look at one source, oh, this is how all people thought. When you look at the totality of primary sources, I think a lot of people have moved on from Brown, and there was not this great sense, you know, leading up to that secession winter, that there was this inevitability of secession. Obviously, when South Carolina does what it does, well, that's when things become a little bit more inevitable. There's a practical reason. So, you know, once Virginia secedes, and once you have that referendum in late May of 1861, where the Commonwealth decides, okay, we're going to secede, they're sending troops there to capture all the arsenal equipment, you know, any sort of blank stocks, barrels, those types of things that would be required. And then of course you have the post commander, Lieutenant Jones, who ends up destroying stuff, and so there's still a lot of machinery that's salvaged. I think there's a concern among people like Josiah Gorgas, Chief of Ordnance for the Confederacy, to try to, you know, stay there as long as possible to maximize the extraction of all that equipment and bring it to Richmond. I think that's more their thinking. Once you get to that point, when you are in early to mid-June, when Davis and Lee are saying, okay, it's okay now to leave Harper's Ferry and go to Winchester, much of that equipment has been pulled out and is en route to Richmond, so they're less concerned about that. But in terms of the symbolic nature of it, I don't think there's any evidence to support that.
How about the Yankee idea of holding Harper's Ferry throughout 62 and then getting trapped there?
Yeah, so obviously, you know, when you look at Harper's Ferry from a Union perspective, it's a little bit different because the B&O Railroad cuts through. I mean, if you think about why President Lincoln, and this goes beyond Harper's Ferry, if you think about why President Lincoln wanted to hold on to the eastern panhandle of what becomes West Virginia, so West Virginia doesn't become a thing until June of 1863, it's because of the B&O. And so there is a real strategic reason for holding on to that place from a Union perspective.
So neither side really was holding on to the Brown mythology at that time.
Correct. Yeah.
About where did the rail line stopped during this time?
Like here.
Right here, like literally right here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. If you look at wartime maps, the spur ends like here.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right, so we are going to head up into that corner of the fort there in the shade.
How you doing? How you doing?
As you can tell, an outdoor effort.
To that point, they would have to
Now we're better.
So, I promised you all an image. So people, when they come to this property, always ask, well, what did it look like during the Civil War? Because clearly that wasn't here during the Civil War and other things weren't here during the Civil War. So this right here is an image from November of 1861 that appeared in Harper's Weekly that showed what this site looks like. So if you look closely at this image, right, here is the Stein family house. That house is not that house. The front entrance was actually rotated. So today you enter that way. Back in the day, the entrance would have been on that part. So the house that was here during the Civil War, this structure was actually destroyed pretty significantly during the Third Battle of Winchester. And so after the conflict, the family comes back. I'm going to say much more about the family here in a moment. They come back and they rebuild the house. That's the structure that stands here today, but it's built on part of the original foundation. And then of course you can see this is the Martinsburg Pike, what is Route 11 today. And of course you can see how very pronounced those earthwork fortifications are. So the family that lived here during the Civil War, the family that gets a visit from William Henry Chase Whiting is the Stein family. Isaac Stein, his wife, and their 4 children. And they range at this time in age from the age of 2 to 9. So Isaac, when the war begins, he is 40 years old. This is an individual who has been, you know, over the past couple of years trying to make this farm into something special. The family moved into this property about 2 weeks before John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. First week of October 1859, the Steins, they close on the property, they move in, they're getting settled, and then 29 miles away, you have John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. He could have never imagined what things would be like, you know, 2 years later. Now, when you look at individuals who live in the Shenandoah Valley, in 1861, when the war breaks out, it's important to understand how people identify themselves. So, some people might think that, well, Winchester, it's in Virginia, Virginia was Confederate, Virginia seceded from the Union, that all the people living in Winchester are pro-Confederate. That is not the case at all. So as a historian, when you look at civilian populations and their loyalties, I think you could break them into 3 categories. Undeniably, the lion's share of people living in Winchester are pro-Confederate. You have about 10 to 15% of the population are pro-Union. What makes them pro-Union? For some, it is their religious beliefs. Traditionally, Quakers, Brethren, Mennonites, they are not pro-Confederate. because of the Confederacy's connection to the institution of slavery. And then you have another segment of the population. I call them the leave-aloners. These are people who don't care about either side. They don't care about how things work out, pro-Union, pro-Confederate. They just care about their families and keeping their families safe and surviving. If you have seen the movie Shenandoah, came out in 1965, stars Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart and his family are leave-aloners for much of that film. I would argue that Isaac Stein is a leave-aloner. He's 40 years old when the war breaks out. He has just purchased this beautiful 380-acre farm, has a wife, has 4 kids. I get it, I'm 46. I just would like to be left alone at times. And so you could imagine the indescribable angst that Isaac Stein feels when Confederates show up and say, you know what, we need to build a fort on your farm. So he says, okay, you can build a fort, but I'm going to start charging you for stuff. This is amazing to me. So as a historian, you know, everything that historians do is always rooted in evidence and fact. We just don't make stuff up. It's not my opinion on things. So many of the records in Richmond were destroyed at the end of the war, but some of those records still survive. So there were what were called Confederate civilian files. Fortunately, the Confederate civilian file for Isaac Stein, it survives. And if you look at his Confederate civilian file, here is a page from that file. There's about 80 or 90 pages in the document. It's really just a whole bunch of bills that he is sending to Joe Johnston for stuff that the Confederates are taking from his property or using on this property. He rents them his wagon. He charges about $4 a week just for the wagon rental. So this is why, you know, when we're talking about where his loyalties rest, this is why I put him in the leave-aloner category. He's clearly not pro-Union, but he is a member of the local militia company, the 31st Virginia Militia, and when they are called to muster, when the war breaks out, he doesn't show up. On his record in the militia records in Richmond, it notes absent. So that also indicates to me, not really pro-Confederate. If you were super gung-ho to support the Confederacy, you might say, okay, you can use my wagon. Now I'm still gonna want money reimbursed for food or whatever, but he's charging them for everything. So that doesn't exude a whole bunch of loyalty to the Confederate cause either. Now, after that decision has been made, Isaac Stein decides keeping his family in a fort that is under construction is no place to raise a family. So he leaves here. He takes his family, he moves not too far from here to a place called Coe Farm. It's in that direction, just northwest of us. And Coe Farm is occupied by relatives. Isaac Stein will stay there until June of 1863. And after June of 1863, after Coe Farm sits right in the path of the fighting at the Second Battle of Winchester on June 14th, he decides, not really a great place to have my family. So he takes his family, he moves to his brother's home in Clark County. The home was called Rosny. It's near Boyce, Virginia. And that's where they'll live for the remainder of the war. After the war, they come back. Now, when he decides to leave and move to Coe Farm, the task of building this fortification is now underway. So construction of the fort is going to begin in the first week of July 1861. The guy who is responsible for managing, supervising the construction of this fort is this guy right here, Cowles Miles Collier. So Cowles Miles Collier was born in Hampton, Virginia in 1836. So he's in his mid to late 20s when the Civil War breaks out. He had attended West Point, but his heart was really in the service of the Navy. So when the war broke out, this is a guy who was born and raised and lived in Hampton, Virginia. He very much wanted to serve in the Confederate Navy. But when he offered his services, the Confederate Navy said, no, we are going to send you to the Shenandoah Valley. You are going to be assigned to Joe Johnston's army in the valley, and you are going to serve as his judge advocate general. So nothing he wanted to do, he is told, you have to do this. And Miles Collier, by the way, has been an elusive figure. This is Fort Collier. I remember many times we're like, who is Collier? And again, you know, doing some digging at the National Archives, I came across this document which unraveled the thing. This is a receipt that Miles Collier submitted to the Confederate Quartermaster's Department in the summer of 1861 from Winchester for paper and quill pens. This document is what identified him as judge advocate, as the guy ultimately who was supervising the construction of this place. So Miles Collier needed to get, first and foremost, a workforce assembled to come in here and build a fort that is going to take an imprint of about 10 acres. Now, if you think about the timing of this, July 7th is when construction really begins. Less than 2 weeks later, Joe Johnston's army is going to be moving out of the Shenandoah Valley to support General P.G.T. Beauregard at Manassas Junction in the first great land battle of the Civil War. So most of the men who are going to be working on the construction of Fort Collier are not going to be from Johnston's command. They are going to be local militia units from this part of the valley. There are going to be about 40 Union prisoners of war who were captured at the Battle of Falling Waters, fought just a few days before construction begins. And Falling Waters is now located in what is West Virginia, kind of near in the northern part of Berkeley County. So you have militia, you have Union POWs, and you're also going to have enslaved people who are impressed by the Confederacy to work on the construction of this fort. So that is who is building this. Fort Collier is to be considered a major earthwork fortification. If you look at it today, it is still pronounced. It is, next to Star Fort, I would argue, the best preserved earthwork fortification within this whole part of the Shenandoah Valley. Now, if you think about this image right here, obviously very pronounced. So as pronounced as this is today, it is much more imposing in 1861 when it's being constructed. So oftentimes I'll bring groups out here and they'll be like, wow, cool rifle pits. These are not rifle pits. So when you build a major field work as this is, you need somewhere to get the material from to construct the parapets and the walls of the fort. This is a ditch. Super technical name. It's a ditch. All right, the ditch is used, that's where all the dirt comes from to build up the walls of the parapet. Now, when you construct an earthwork fortification, you need to have also additional items to build it up. So if you think about the height of these parapet walls in this image, they are pretty pronounced. So when this was constructed, this ditch is about 10 to 15 feet deep. Those walls are about 8 to 10 feet high. So they're going to take all kinds of debris. They're going to cut down trees, they're going to use barrels, garbage, whatever they can get their hands on to build up the walls of the fort and then pack in the earth around it. Now, as this fort is being constructed, and this is amazing to me, it is essentially functioning not only as a fortification site under construction, but as a tourist site. And so we're going to move inside of Fort Collier a little bit, talk about this as a tourist site in 1861, and what the tourists who were coming here were seeing. what was happening here, about the construction, about the people who were working here, and all those types of things. Questions?
You had mentioned about Mr. Stein.
Yes.
How about his wife? Margaret,
Rachel?
Rachel, Purtlebaugh. How was the Purtlebaugh family involved? Do you know anything about that?
In terms of loyalties?
Loyalties and where they were?
Yeah, there's no, I mean, we have no written documentary evidence that notes what those loyalties are. So we just don't know.
I'm just wondering about the line of sight. How far could you see from this fort? I mean, there's a lot of trees here, but was it
Yeah.
miles or yards or?
Yeah, so you think about this, so, you know, we're kind of raised up. So again, this is all open. You think about like 37, that was built up over the time. So you could see, you have on a clear day, you could see as far as your eye could, so miles. You had a very, very clear vision. So again, if you're thinking about this from the perspective of William Henry Chase Whiting and Collier and Johnston, you are going to have fair warning, especially on a clear day, that Patterson is approaching Winchester.
I know we've got Fort Loudon about a mile south of here towards Winchester. Is there any particular reason they chose not to expand that and instead build here, or was there much coordination between the two forts?
Yeah, so there's a structure on Fort Loudon at that point. So Fort Loudon Seminary. So it's not a usable site. And then the other thing is, if you think about defending a city, that's within the city already. So in 1861, there's nothing really around here. So you have a little bit of a buffer between city proper and the outskirts. So even if, I would argue, even if Fort Loudon was still usable, which it wasn't as a site, this is still going to be the better strategic choice. Other questions?
How would you characterize this fort versus, let's say, Fort Ward around Washington? Is as big? Is it substantial?
Oh yeah. So I mean, this is a fortification that has, when it's constructed, it is mounted with at least 10 heavy siege guns in the early part of the war. Is it as big as and imposing as some of those forts outside of DC, Fort Ward, Fort Totten, Fort Stevens? Probably not. But in terms of the valley, aside from Fort Garibaldi, which becomes Fort Banks, which becomes Fort Milroy, which becomes the main fort, which is over there, this is the most significant fortification in the city. Next one. All right, so we are going to proceed down this way.